In this presentation on writing quiz questions that require higher order thinking, we will explore the basics of writing effective multiple choice quiz questions and review some examples of how we can rewrite these questions to assess higher order thinking in your students. When developing a quiz for your online course, the first thing you want to identify is the learning objectives you are trying to assess. Look at the Bloom's level for each objective and figure out what types of questions you can ask to encourage the type of thinking you're aiming for in your courses. Next, you will write and revise your quiz questions. It's always good to test out some of these questions with a small group of students to see if there are any points of confusion in the way they're written. You can then spend some time revising your questions before adding them to your test bank. Most learning management systems also offer analytics, which can show you the data on the questions, including who's getting them right and wrong, which can help you to analyze what it is about the questions that's tripping up your students. Let's take a look at Bloom's taxonomy, which is a way of organizing levels of learning that many instructors use to develop learning objectives. At the bottom of this taxonomy, you see the behavior that's least cognitively challenging, which is recollection. This requires students to memorize and recall facts. This is the level at which many of our quiz questions are written, just asking students to recall basic information. Next comes the understanding level, where we ask students to try to make sense of the facts. Up a level, students must apply the facts that they've learned. And next is the analysis of content, where students identify relationships of parts to a whole. Toward the top, one of the higher levels of cognitive processing requires students to evaluate or make judgments. When looking at Bloom's taxonomy, you can see that all of the levels in blue can be tested using multiple choice quiz questions. Despite the fact that most quiz questions tend to be at the first level, which is recall, with some of the work we can begin to build quiz questions that measure higher level skills. Creating, which is at the topmost level of the taxonomy, is something that can't really be assessed using a quiz question, and therefore is better suited to essays or projects. Here are some examples of the Bloom's levels, which show the type of questions that would assess learning at each of those levels. Starting with remembering, where we ask students to recall facts. These types of questions ask the definition of something or require students to list the characteristics. The skill required is basic recollection of information. Quiz questions which ask students to explain something assess the student's level of understanding of the content. Applying is where we assess whether students are using the facts accurately. Many math problems fall into this category, and math problems are great in a multiple choice format. Analyzing asks students to determine relationships. Therefore, the quiz questions are more like scenarios or case studies, where you present the case to students and students have to analyze the facts and answer very specific questions. So at this level, they're drawing on skills from all of the lower levels of the taxonomy. They must remember, understand, and apply the content in order to answer questions at this level. And finally, we have evaluating. Judgments made based on a set of criteria. So here you would provide questions where students have to evaluate some sort of statement based on a set of criteria. Again, this requires students to be able to do everything that falls below this level on the taxonomy. And again, as mentioned in the previous slide, it's not really possible to assess a student's ability to create through the use of quiz questions. Although asking students themselves to design questions on a quiz is a way of measuring their ability to create. Here are a few of the advantages and disadvantages of multiple choice questions. First of all, multiple choice questions are efficient, by which I mean they can be automatically graded. This saves you as the instructor a great deal of time. So instead of going through and grading each quiz, the computer can do it for you, and your time can be spent instead engaging with the students. Having these types of questions throughout your course can enable students to self-check their own level of understanding without requiring any work from you. Multiple choice questions are also versatile, meaning that they can be used in all different disciplines. They can test many different things: discrimination between facts, opinion, applying principles. They can even interpret relationships and analyze phenomena. As we pointed out with Bloom's taxonomy, we can basically test any level of a student's skill with the content. In terms of validity, you can get a really good picture of student learning by using multiple choice quiz questions. They do a good job of measuring students' progress toward the content. And finally, Multiple choice quizzes are reliable. They're less susceptible to guessing than something like a true-false question. There's more consistency in grading because there's only one correct answer. So the grading is more consistent and reliable throughout the quizzes. However, on the disadvantages side, there's also a lack of versatility. So while you can assess many different things, there are some things that cannot be tested through multiple choice questions. Multiple choice questions are also less prone to guessing than true and false questions. However, a student can still guess because you're providing them with potential answers. Therefore, it is possible that students can succeed on the test just by guessing on all of the questions. And finally, one of the biggest disadvantages is the difficulty of constructing questions. It is very time consuming to create good multiple choice questions. However, as we go over in this workshop, there are many strategies to make this process easier. So let's review the basic terms used when writing multiple choice questions. A multiple choice question is made up of two parts. One is the stem, which is the question, and the other is the alternatives, which is the list of answers from which the students can choose from. The stem provides the context or the problem that the student is addressing, and the alternatives are made up of the correct answer as well as distractors, which are the other possible answers that a student might choose from. There are several best practices to keep in mind when writing multiple choice question stems. Keep the stem relevant and meaningful to the objectives you are trying to assess. Make the question clear and concise. Don't include any extraneous information in the stem. Keep it to the point so that students don't get confused. Within your stem, make sure you are not providing any clues that would help the students to guess the correct answer or lead them to know exactly which response is correct. And finally, in general, avoid negative constructions. When students are faced with a long series of questions, it is common that they begin to feel fatigued and lose a bit of their concentration. When questions are constructed in a negative way, students can sometimes overlook the negative and therefore get confused about what's being asked. The point is not to trip up or confuse students, but rather to truly assess whether they are meeting your stated learning objectives. So let's use some of these best practices in writing stems to evaluate some sample questions. Take a look at the stem for this question. Take a minute to read it and then review the STEM best practices in the purple box in the lower corner. Which of these best practices does this stem violate? Don't provide correct answer clues. The word "and" provides a clue as to what goes in the blank. The only option from the list that would follow the word "and" is apple. Here's a better way of writing the question. We eliminated the "and" note that we also got rid of the word apocryphal because it may have been confusing for students. Here's another example. Take a moment to read the stem. Is there anything about this stem that violates our best practices? To me, there's too much information in this stem. It fails to keep the content relevant and meaningful, and it doesn't make the question clear. This could confuse students and get away from measuring what we really want to know. Here is the stem rewritten. We have reduced the cognitive load by reducing the amount of information we provide in the stem. Let's look at one more. What's wrong with this stem? This is an example of a negative construction. You are giving the students a list of correct procedures and asking them to select the one that is incorrect. The word "except" could easily be overlooked by the students. The question isn't as clear as it could be. By bolding the word "except," we draw the students' attention to the fact that this is a negative construction of the question. This ensures that you're not testing their ability to pay attention, but rather their ability to answer the question. Now we move on to best practices in writing alternatives. Remember, alternatives are the answer options that students must pick from. The first best practice is to limit the alternatives to 3 to 5. Research supports this as being the optimal number of options for students. The reason being that this finds a great balance between a good test of students' knowledge by minimizing reliability concerns of being able to guess. 4 is what most people generally aim for. We also want to use parallel constructions in our alternatives, which means formatting the alternatives in the same way so that we don't give students any clues as to what the right response might be. We want to avoid using always or never options, avoid using keywords that might help students guess the answer without really having any knowledge, avoid overlap or two alternatives that might be possible answers to the question. And for our distractors, which are the incorrect answers, some best practices include making the distractors plausible so students will entertain them as possible answers. We want them to be functional, or be able to be the correct response, and we want them to be based on student misconceptions, or things that often confuse students. This will help you to analyze whether students really understand what you're measuring. Here's a sample question. What's wrong with these alternatives? You will notice that some of these alternatives overlap. For example, it lives for many years is the same as it lives for more than 1 year. So that makes it impossible for students to choose between these two selections. You may also notice that the question STEM asks how long plants live, and the alternatives talk about how long plants live, die, or need to be replanted. Since these alternatives do not all address how long a plant lives, they make it easier for students to guess which might be the correct response. Here's a revision of the question. You can see that the alternatives are now all written to talk about the same thing, length of life in years. We've also removed the overlapping responses. Here's another one. What's wrong with these alternatives? Looking at the list, you can see that two of the alternatives are obviously not plausible. The question asks for an artist, but two of these responses are fictional characters that can quickly be eliminated. That increases the chance that the student will be able to guess the correct response, and therefore you'll receive an inaccurate view of the student's knowledge. We've now written the question so that there are plausible distractors. Now all of the alternatives are actual artists that could plausibly be the correct answer. Here is one more look at using best practices to develop alternatives. Looking at this question and the alternatives provided, you can see two of them are implausible. There are keywords within the alternatives which give away the answer. We're asking students about journal articles, and one of the answers has the keyword journals in it. Even if this was the wrong answer, students are going to be drawn to this response if they are at all unsure about the correct answer. Here's a revision. By adding in plausible alternatives, all of which include the word education in their title, we cut down on the student's ability to guess. And by removing the word journal from one of the responses, we again require the student to know something about the topic, rather than just picking the one that sounds most likely correct. Now let's take a look at some revisions which move the questions up a level in cognitive ability. Here's an example of a basic recall type of question. We're just asking the student to recall a set of facts in a certain order. This is the most basic of Bloom's taxonomy, recall. So here we've rewritten the question to address the next level up, the understanding level. This way the question is now written. The students have to recall all of the steps and then understand what happens in one certain step. So it's harder for the students to guess, and they have to clearly understand the answer in order to make a selection. Remember our original question, the way it was written asked students for the correct order of the stages, and that was a simple recall question. It has now been written so that students do need to recall the stages, but they also must analyze a scenario. They have to read the question, analyze it, break it apart, understand what's being asked, recall the facts, and demonstrate their understanding, all to answer this one question. So we've looked at the basic structure of multiple choice questions and talked about the process of writing the stems and alternatives in ways that truly measure the student's level of understanding. Now continue reading and exploring the content in this workshop to learn more about writing effective quiz questions.